Hello and welcome. I am Bright Nanakwesi Aminin, and my guest for the interview today is Professor Samuel KOBINA Anim, government statistician. We are talking about everything statistics here in Ghana. Don't go anywhere, stay with us. All right, welcome back, and I'm still here with Professor Samuel KOBINA Anim, who is government statistician. We are talking about statistics in Ghana and their latest review that says Ghana 2022 earnings inequality in the public sector. Quite an interesting review here, and I really want to talk about it. Nice having you here on the conversation.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure.
I've actually gone through this, and it's quite interesting, I must say. Tell me what exactly prompted you to do this particular survey.
So a number of reasons. One is we are adhering to our mandate, which has to do with providing the government, advising the government on contemporary issues that would inform the development that we seek. We focused on inequality because as a country over the years, we've measured inequality only from one perspective, which is the consumption expenditure inequality. And we've done that over an interval of every 5 years when we do the Living Standard survey. This does not help us in addressing our growth and development challenges. I mean, if you want to have a steady growth, if you want your growth to turn out into development, you should get to a point where your inequality peaks and begins to reduce. So measuring it every 5 years does not really help us to understand the dynamics of it, and we've restricted ourselves to only one space of the measurement, which has to do with consumption expenditure inequality. What we've done now is giving us another space by which we are measuring inequality, which is from the earnings perspective, which is quite different from the consumption expenditure perspective. And secondly, the mode by which we've collected the data would allow us to, even on a monthly basis, assess our earnings inequality, because this is data that is coming from the Controller and Accountant General Department. Public sector employees are paid on a monthly basis, so every month we should be able to put this out. We're not going to do this because it doesn't change, earnings doesn't change that regularly. So what we plan doing is at least every year we should be able to come out with two releases of earnings inequality. Stepping back to the question that you asked, we have as a country sought to reduce our poverty, and it's sometimes, I would say, unfortunate that we treat statistics only as headline figures. So we hear that poverty is going down and that ends the story. But poverty and inequality are entangled in a way that you cannot talk about poverty without talking about inequality. Indeed, what Ghana Statistical Service does is anytime we say X number of people are poor, our report will further go down and say that they are poor by this extent. So if you are using the absolute line to measure poverty, we say that, let's say, 23.4% of the population are below the poverty line, so they are poor. But what is important is how far are they from the poverty line? That is a gap issue. That is an inequality issue. And among the 23.4 people who are below the poverty line, what are the disparities across them? And that is what inequality does. Otherwise, you keep on putting in interventions and some people would forever remain poor because you don't know the extent to which they are far from the poverty line. We just say poverty has reduced. So this is why we are trying to push forward the conversation on inequality to meet that global agenda, which says that we don't have to leave anybody behind. We are very much aware that an equal state is unattainable. We are not putting this out there to say that Ghana should drive towards equality. That's not it. What we are pushing forward is equity.
I was just about to come to that. I mean, the difference between equality and equity when it comes to statistics. What exactly is it? The definition and the similarities, and if there's even anything like similarities in there?
Oh, there is. I mean, the first one is that I am getting this, you are not getting this. It's unequal. You get it. Then the second part is, which is equity, is am I getting this because of this circumstance, or you are not getting that because of that circumstance? So that is where the equity comes in. That is where the fairness comes in. Based on what you are doing, based on your circumstance, you have access to X amount of resources. So it's not an issue of whether you are getting it or not, but equity ties in with what you are doing. And that is one of the reasons why we did this work. Across the MDAs, we realized that there is unequal average average earnings across the government ministries, department, and agencies. And what we are asking is, does it mean that some ministries, departments, and agencies are more productive than others? Because Ghana is deploying a universal salary structure, which simply means that the only variation in earnings should be as a result of different grades. So I've been there for a longer period, I have this qualification, so I entered at a higher level than you. So once you're on different grades, there are differences in earnings. But if you're on the same grade, irrespective of your sex, irrespective of your age, irrespective of your location, we should all get the same amount of money. So technically, we should not see that much inequality in when it comes to our earnings.
I want us to take our time and break into pieces the collection of data that you have now. Let's begin with the regions. And interestingly, Savannah region seems to have the biggest across the country when it comes to territory. But it looks like they're recording very low than the Ashanti region and the Greater Accra region being the capital. So in Savannah region, government employs about 9,646 people, okay, and it forms about just 1% of the entire government population employees in the on the payroll of government. In Ashanti region has 18%, which is about 125,333, and Accra has 17% as well, which is 113,723. If we are to mark the employment of government per the size of region, I don't know if that is to say, but if that's supposed to be a problem, why are we recording more employment in the Ashanti region compared to Savannah and even Greater Accra, which is the capital of the country?
So a number of factors should come to play when you're having this conversation, one of which you said, which is the land size. So the land size, I'm not too sure whether should be a criteria for determining the number of government employees that we should have in the region. But definitely the population should play a role. Definitely their state of development should play a role. And definitely the development trajectory that the government has should also play a role in determining the number of government employees. Having said that, as a country, we should say to ourselves that for each administrative region, because it's at the subnational region, at the subnational level, all the regions should have a certain minimum number of government employees, because you expect X number of government ministries to reside in each region. I'm not too sure if that conversation has ensued and whether it's publicly known that in every region there should be a minimum of, let's say, 9,000 people, government employees, based on X number of government institutions that we expect to have in the region. So if that has been established, that is fine. Then the next question is, if you are using population, we just did a population and housing census. Greater Accra was the most populous region, followed by Ashanti region. So one would argue that it's not surprising that we have a lot more government employees in Ashanti and Greater Accra region. If you want to push the discussion further, one will say that given that Greater Accra was the most populous region from the 2021 population and housing census, why do we have more government employees in Ashanti region than Greater Accra region? But that is what we are doing as Ghana Statistical Service. We put out these numbers so that we get policymakers to think through why they are doing certain things and the potential consequences associated with it.
A bit out of your box, but isn't this where we get to say that the decentralization isn't working? Because we're looking at spreading our wings across all board. But the Savannah is having just 1%, and the Ashanti region is having 18%, and Greater Accra is having 70%. A bit of disparity there. Can you tell me more about that?
You see, one thing that as a statistician or as a service we don't do is provide qualitative responses to things. I mean, I would not in any way say that decentralization is not working if I'm not backing it with numbers. And that is exactly what the Ghana Statistical Service is doing. As a country, when we started with the decentralization conversation, what statistical targets did we have? So now we are collaborating with all the MDAs. We've inaugurated the National Statistics Advisory Committee, and one of the major mandates of the National Statistics Advisory Committee is to ensure that all government policies have statistical targets. So that once we are having this conversation, we say that when we were starting with decentralization, these were our targets. After 10 years, this is where we are. Then we can comfortably make that statement that decentralization is working or otherwise.
So one of the also biggest conversations when it comes to employment worldwide is gender, the female and male. How many of women are employed in government, even in parliament? It was a big conversation. How many of our parliamentarians are females? And here we have a case whereby a percentage of 54.4% are male employed by government. Given the number at 374,477 for male and 313,507 for female employed by government. Interesting one there. Now, whilst you did this survey on women and men who have been employed by government, what was the, to ask, the most common conversation from both parties as to why they think the numbers are not equal, or like you mentioned earlier, either equality or inequality? What really is the reason why?
So this publication is on earnings inequalities. So what we sought to find out, one, whether there is a gender pay gap, that is what we call it, and if there is a gender pay gap, do we see that to an extent that is worrying, or we see it in a way that is consistent with our expectation? So what we are talking about is a situation where, in terms of number of employees, we have 54.4% of them being males. Again, one would argue that on the back of the population housing census, which we've shown that we have a greater population of women than men, why do we see the reverse when it comes to government? But then this comes back to what I was saying earlier on. What is the government's policy in hiring? The second conversation will be that, do we see a lot more inequality across men and women, or we see it within men and we see it within women? We did record that variation of 165 Ghana cedis gender pay gap. That is, males are earning 165 Ghana cedis more than what women are earning. From our point of view, what is striking is the variations across the regions. Although we see a national figure of 165, we see that the Upper West region recorded the highest variation of about 328 Ghana cedis, and the Central region recorded the least. So the question is, why do we have these variations across the 16 administrative regions? What is more striking for us is that that difference of 165 Ghana cedis contributes less to the inequality. We see a lot more inequality among men and a lot more inequality among women. And that is where I think the conversation should go, and ask ourselves, why are we seeing a lot of within sex inequality relative to across sex inequality?
I'm also seeing here that out of every 5 public sector employees earn less than 3,000 Ghana cedi. Out of 4 out of 5 public sector employees earn less than 3,000 Ghana cedi. Can you tell me a bit more about this?
I mean, that is what the data says, and that is what it is. I mean, you have about 560,000 out of the 688,000 public sector workers earning less than 3,000 Ghana cedis. Let's put 2 twists to this conversation. One is the level, and the other is the inequality part. So if X number of people, that is 80%, are earning less than 3,000. The next question is, the 20% that are earning more than 3,000, is it because they are more productive than the 3,000? This is what we want to drive the conversation into. If you are looking at it from the perspective of levels, then one is concerned about how are they surviving? What are the implications for their pension? And are they meeting the basic survival needs? So these are the conversations that we should have among ourselves, given this revelation.
That's an interesting conversation, but then I'm also trying to understand what exactly the problem could be when it comes to... Okay, so according to this report, there are parts of Ghana that people might be doing the same work, but the payment or salaries differ. Per your research or per your gathering, what was really the issue? What was really the reason why we can see somebody in Greater Accra doing the same work as somebody in the Savannah, but with different salary structure?
So let's interpret this very carefully. As I said, Ghana is deploying a universal salary structure scheme, which means that if I'm an accountant in Greater Accra and you're an accountant in Upper West region, we are being paid the same. What we are talking here about is the average. So if you take all the employees in Greater Accra region relative to all the employees in Upper East region, what is the average? What that simply means is that we have a lot more people in Greater Accra who are on higher grades relative to those in the Upper East region. Because if you're on the same grade, we are getting the same pay. I mean, if you're an accountant, I'm an accountant. if I'm to earn higher than you, then maybe I'm, let's say, on step H or step L because I've been in the job a much longer time. Maybe I entered as a chartered accountant, so when I entered, I went into a level lower than somebody entering with a first degree qualification who has read accounting from any of our universities. Do you get it? So your entry point determines your grade given your level, and the number of years that you spent in the public service also leads to accumulation of higher salaries. So if you are looking at this from the regional point of view, all that we are saying is that it means on the average we should have a lot more people in Greater Accra with higher grades relative to those in Ashanti region or Upper West region.
But what really can be done about this? Because if we are all doing the same work, and regardless of the grade that you have or whatever that you have in connection with your certificates and all that, we might all be turning out the same results or having the same position. Why do we necessarily have to get, so to say, this disparity when it comes to the salary distribution?
I mean, this is exactly what we are saying. If it can be proven that you are all doing the same work, your results are the same, your productivity is the same, then technically there shouldn't be any variation. But if definitely I have entered into an employment in a strategic position, my responsibilities are higher than somebody lower my level, then that is where the issue of fairness, equity comes in. That's why I said that an equal state is not possible. It's unattainable.
It's never possible.
We've not seen any equal state. I mean, whatever we do, it's about equity. It's about getting based on what you are able to do. And that is what we should strive towards. We say that reduce inequality, but keep in mind that an unequal state would always be with us.
Then that is not we fighting for equality. If you are fighting for equality and still keeping in mind that an unequal state will always be with us, then we are not fighting for equality.
I wouldn't say that. You see, the conversation should move away from either black or white. The issue is about between black and white is equity. Do you get it? Our responsibilities vary. Our capacities vary. Our productivity varies. So based on this, you have to pay based on productivity, based on output. But what we are striving is minimizing the extent. That is what we are emphasizing. Let's minimize the extent of inequality. So all that you do is that those lower down there that you are earning more than them, over time, let them be as productive as you are. And that is how society grows. So inequality is a very basic economic theory which says that if a nation begins to grow, the nation becomes more unequal. But once the nation reaches a certain growth state, it minimizes inequality. And that is when the nation begins to see the returns of growth, which is development.
Let's now, I'm seeing this, it says differences between payrolls, ministries, departments, and agencies, MMDAs. And it says that the average salary of workers on the payroll with the highest average earnings is 22,925 Ghana cedis. It's more than 14 times the average salary of workers on the payroll at the bottom, which is 1,619 Ghana cedi. The difference between the average salary of workers on payrolls with the highest average earnings, 22,925 Ghana cedis, and the average of next set of employees on the payroll is 13,062 Ghana cedi. It's 1.8 times higher. How do you explain this?
So the data that we got from the Controller and Accountant General's Department puts government employees into 129 different payrolls. And these payrolls, they include, for instance, political appointees, people working with the legal service, people on Article 71, all the MDAs under the Ministry of Finance. So for instance, if you take the payroll for Ministry of Health, you have the Ghana Health Service, and you have all the other agencies under the Ministry of Health. So these are the different payrolls that we got from the data from the Controller and Accountant General Department. And if you find the average earnings across these different payrolls, you realize that the group that is earning highest has an average of, as you said, 22,925, and the group that is earning the lowest is earning only 1,619. And the difference between these two figures is 14 times. So again, it takes us back to say to ask the question: does it mean that those earning 22,925 are more productive 14 times than those at the bottom who are earning 1,619? And the same applies to the government ministries, departments, and agencies. We saw that the ministry that is earning the highest on the average is attracting about 9,900 Ghana cedis, and the MDA that is attracting the least is attracting about 2,200 Ghana cedis, suggesting about a 4 times difference between these two government ministries. So the question again is, does it mean that one ministry is more productive than the other, or otherwise? So in the next 3 years, what Ghana Statistical Service is going to do is work towards the measurement of labor productivity.
Good.
So that with time we can compare the earnings and the labor productivity to see whether there is reason why these earnings should exist. Because on a productivity side too, we should see that much difference between the payrolls and also across the government MDAs.
If you are taking 22,000 and I'm taking like 1,000 Ghana cedis and I end up doing your job for you, then you should be questioned. Now here it says there's contribution of earnings inequality among employees on the same grade is very negligible at 7%. Relative to differences across the grades, 93%. The differences in earnings across income groups are more pronounced compared to variations within income groups. The contribution of earnings inequality within MDAs, 88.0%, is significantly higher than variations across MDAs, 12.0%. Inequalities in net salaries of public sector employees are largely explained by the differences in salaries between persons in the same demographic group or location, as we talk about region. Now, interestingly, I'm seeing that it says grade 7, grade 93. I don't know if the camera can capture this. Grade 7, grade 93, income group 18%, 82%, payroll 72%, 28%, ministry 88%, 12%. Years worked 92%, 8%, region 96%, 4%, gender 100%. And this is so the move here is talking about within group, right? And the B here means between group. What's happening here?
So this is exactly what we talked about earlier on. Once you estimate the inequality, you can go to the next step and look at the relative contribution of the inequality that is attributed to what is happening within the group, and the inequality attributable to across the group. So you see that for the grade, we see a lot more between groups rather than within groups. So the within group variation is accounting for only 7% of the variation. And this is exactly the reasoning underlying the universal salary structure. And I've said this a couple of times. The universal salary structure allows that variation should occur only across grades. Within grades, there shouldn't be any variation. So what we are seeing here is that 93% of the inequality is attributed to variations across grade, because if you're on a lower grade, you get a lower salary. If you're on a higher grade, you get a higher salary. If you come to the income group 2, it's the same. I mean, the income group is simply putting people less than 1,000, between 1,000 and 2,000, and so on. So you don't expect to see variations within the group. Within the group, you put all people within earning less than 1,000 together. So within that group, you are not seeing any variation. That is why you are seeing only 18%. But then, if you take it outside the group, 82%, then those earning less than 1,000 and those earning between 1,000 and 2,000, you see that inequality. So a lot of the variation is attributed to the between income groups. From our point of view, what is striking for us is, you remember we just had a conversation on across MDAs, the variations that we see. This analysis is telling us that even within MDAs, there's still inequality. And within MDA, inequality contributes more to the inequality rather than between MDA. That is why Ghana Statistical Service is putting itself forward, telling all government MDAs that we can do this analysis for each MDA. so that you don't have to wait for the productivity study that GSS is going to do. As an MDA, you should understand, as a government ministry, department and agency, you should understand the earnings inequality that resides in your ministry. And then within your ministry, you should be able to ask yourself, does it mean that people are more productive than others? You don't need to wait for GSS to do that.
But does it have to take 3 years for you to come out with the productivity and the gap and all that?
At the national level, it takes a lot of work.
So how long did it even take for you to come out with this session?
This was pretty straightforward. It took us less than 3 months to do this. Because as I said, we were relying on administrative data that is collected by the Controller and Accountant General Department. But if you want to measure labor productivity, then you need to get data on capital and labor for all the government ministries, for all the sectors that we have, and also at the subnational level. And for you to make any estimates, we need data that would take us back to as far as 3 years ago, and that would be, 30 years ago, that would be the basis for predicting some data gaps. As a country, we've never measured labor productivity. We only get a sense of labor when we do our living standard survey. And that data, those data points, we have only 8 data points. And we need this data on an annual basis to enable us predict our productivity going forward. So it's a lot of work to estimate labor productivity.
I want to find out, some of the challenges they go through when it comes to gathering information for their collection of data and statistics, and also how expensive it is for them. Make sure that they have the right data. And if there's any connection between the Ghana Statistical Service, the NIA, and other institutions that use data collected from Ghanaians, what exactly are they used for? And how do they even come in as an outfit to regulate all these things? And aside that, I want to talk about inflation, statements out there and all that, but that will be after a quick turn. So I'm still here with Professor Samuel, and he is Ghana Statistician. We are talking about statistics here in Ghana, the collection, the problems, and what exactly could be done with it once it's done by government. And I know that definitely anytime you collect this data, government works with it. So we'll talk about that after the break. Stay with us, don't go anywhere. All right, welcome back. And I'm still here with Professor Samuel KOBINA Anim. He is government statistician, the man in charge for all the statistics we hear and see in the country. Helps government to make decisions when it comes to make sure that there is equality, equity, and no disparities. Welcome back. Let's now talk about inflation. And one of Ghana's biggest conversation. It looks like in about 20 months we are recording a lower number, which is about 53.1%, 53.6% compared to what we saw last month. What accounted for this?
So you're right. Since May 2021, we've seen an upward variation in our CPI and inflation. And we started last year with a figure of 13.9 and consistently rose to 54.1. So in January, we've seen a reversal of this 19-month continuous upward increase in inflation by a dip of 0.5 percentage points. We always urge users of our data to look at the disaggregates rather than the aggregates, because the headline figures would not really tell you what the policy triggers are. So I'm excited you are interested in what the triggers are, and this takes us to the disaggregation. Anytime we compute inflation, we disaggregate it into food and non-food inflation, inflation associated with imported items relative to inflation associated with locally produced items. For January 2023, we saw that food inflation was 61% and non-food inflation was 47.9%. For you to understand which is contributing to the 53.6, you need to look at food and non-food as at December 2022 relative to January 2023. So we realized that food inflation inched up by 1.3 percentage points. That is to say that in December 2022, food inflation was 59.7. And then in January 2023, food inflation was 61. So although the national figure showed a dip by 0.5 percentage point, food inflation was the reverse, because food inflation went up by 1.3%. Then when you come to non-food inflation, in December 2022, non-food inflation was 49.9%. And then, as I said earlier on, in January 2023, non-food inflation was 47.9, which indicates that non-food inflation dropped by 2 percentage points. So one could argue that the driver of the 0.5 dip that we saw was more from a non-food inflation perspective rather than a food inflation perspective. The same argument can be made if you do the disaggregation across imported items, inflation for imported items relative to inflation for locally produced items. In January 2023, we recorded a 12.5 percentage point variation between imported items and locally produced items. Indeed, imported items was 62.5% relative to non-food being 50.0%. Again, one would clearly see that inflation on imported items did not contribute to the dip that we saw, but rather the dip that we saw was as a result of locally produced items. So then the question would be, are we now seeing more from our agricultural sector and so on and so forth? For us, what is striking is if you do further disaggregation and get to the item level, we compute inflation using 307 items. And to guide policymakers, we always put out the top 20 items that saw the highest variation on a year-on-year basis and on a month-on-month basis. Across these 20 items that we published, again, we saw diesel and petrol, shelled granules being part of the top 5 items. All these items on a year-on-year basis recorded more than 100% change on a year-on-year basis. On a month-on-month basis, we saw that diesel dropped by, that is between December 2022 and January 2023, diesel dropped by 11.4%, and petrol dropped by 5.4%, I think. What this tells us is that what we saw at the pumps, all of us would bear witness to that. We saw that from November, we've consistently seen a drop in diesel and a drop in petrol. That is why we recorded the deflation for these two items. Once these drop, what we ask policymakers is that, does it translate in a drop in bus and trotro fares?
I was coming to
we
that.
didn't see that.
Someone might say, you are telling me all the figures, 5%, 20% and all that. But then how does it affect spending? How, when it comes to the lay person on the street, how do I get affected by the decline in the figures?
So that's what I'm saying. It affects us differently. For those of us who buy fuel from the pump, we see the direct effect. I mean, anytime I go to the pump and it's reduced by 50 pesos, 1 Ghana cedis, I feel it. It reduces my expenditure. But if you are somebody who is not using a car and you rely on bus and trotro fares, you need to see a translation of the drop in diesel and petrol to a reduction in bus and trotro fares. It is that change that is not happening. We say it's sticky when prices are going down, because economic agents do not react in the same way when prices are increasing relative to when prices are reducing. So what we are getting policymakers to think about is, can we begin to engage with these unions of the bus and trotro fares to see how they can respond as and when prices reduce? If bus and trotro fares reduces, the next question is, will the transporters of food items also reduce their prices? So we always say that there is a lag effect anytime something happens in an economy, be it a price increase or a price reduction, and how economic agents react to these price changes at the higher level.
Now, there's a statement that goes like, inflation never declines. In as much as we are seeing it drop by some figures, I think we say this because we don't see any time it decline. We don't see the effect on our spending. You know, if I'm picking trotro from Circle to, let's say, to Mobile and paying for Ghana City, and there's a decline in inflation, or let's say petrol, fuel price and all that, I'm still paying the same amount of money. I'm not seeing a decline on the prices. What exactly should we be doing to ensure that once there's a decline or reduction of prices on the market, it reflect on our spending? What should government be doing about all this?
So the government always has two options. One is whether to put in controls or allow the market to work. I mean, over time, we've all seen that government controls can be very disruptive. It can distort the behavior. It gets people not to allow the market to determine things. And that is why Ghana, we are not practicing price controls. So I really subscribe to that. But in between controls or otherwise, it's always the gray area of negotiation. We can put in suasion at different levels to ensure that some actors like aggregators, like the unions and so on, can intervene indirectly to ensure that the final sellers do respond to changes in the prices at a higher level.
Let's now talk about this. Quite an interesting one there. I want to find out what are the differences, what are the different methodologies used in measuring inflation? Are there even types of methodologies or how you go about calculating inflation?
Yes, there are different types of measuring inflation, but we have been consistent with our approach because it's internationally approved, and I can say on authority that significant number of countries are using the same method that we are using, which is the Consumer Price Index approach. I mean, recently we heard people talking about inflation from the perspective of purchasing power parity using exchange rate and so on and so forth. But what we actually do and believe is the right thing to do, scientifically proven, is that on a monthly basis you go out and you collect prices. And anytime you do a living standard survey, you try to identify items that are consumed by persons in Ghana and put weights on these items to signify the relative importance of these items. So as I indicated, you find in our basket 307 items. The item that has the highest weight, so of all the 307 items, if you put their relative weights together, they should sum up to 100%. Think about it. 307 items. If you put all the weights together, you should get 100%. What that means is that if they are to be distributed equally, then each item should have less than 1%, because you have 307 items.
Exactly.
But bars and trotro fares, which is one of the 307 items, has a weight of 5.8. It tells you the importance that persons in Ghana put on bars and trotro fares. This is simply because most of our workers are on bus, are on trotro every morning, every night and day. So it's a significant share of their monthly expenditure. Do you get it?
Yeah.
Diesel and fuel, they are also items, but they have lower weights relative to bus and trotro fares. That is why we keep emphasizing that if diesel and petrol price reduces, what is important is for us to know when and the extent to which bus and trotro fares will reduce, because it's a significant share of our calculation of inflation. The other thing you need to keep in mind is that the Consumer Price Index approach calculates the previous year's index as the denominator and the current year's index as the numerator. So what happened last year with the various spikes that we saw in our CPI leading to spikes in our inflation is going to impact the inflation figures that we're going to record this year. We're going to have a larger denominator relative to whatever we are going to record this year. And this is what we as Statistical Service refer to it as the base drift effect. Because once your denominator is huge, it will naturally reduces your inflation figure if it doesn't change over time.
I actually asked you this question because for about 2 or 3 months now, we've had some school of thought challenging the outcome of your inflation search and all that. So just last month, January, we have Steve Hank saying that the general inflation stood at 77%, which was far different from what we had from your outfit. What do you think might be accounting for his figures compared to what you've been getting from the market?
I mean, we put out a statement explaining the variations in our approach relative to that of Professor Hankey.
But he still believes that the country is going down the tube, regardless of the explanation you gave.
I mean, he's entitled to it. I mean, why should we take that away from him? What we have to do is get people to understand the variations in the methodologies and allow people to scientifically say that this is what we need. Think about it. Every month, we are collecting data on prices and outputs relative to the importance that people place on these items. So there are 3 variables that we use in calculating inflation: prices, quantities, and the importance, which we measure by the weights. And another approach, which he calls the purchasing power parity approach, which relies on exchange rate. That's all that is doing. All that is doing is that look at exchange rate variations and use that to compute inflation. Where lies the importance of the items? Where lies the items that are not internationally tradable? You find in our 307 items like Kobe. What purchasing power parity are you going to put on Kobe?
So is it to say that his figures are nothing to go by?
I would not even give it a second eye. I've read his methodology. I've seen a number of people reacting to his methodology. And as far as I'm concerned, that issue is behind us as a country. And this is what I'm saying. Would you want to use exchange rate to calculate inflation? Exchange rate only impacts inflation indirectly. What impacts inflation? What is inflation? Average price changes. So why would you use exchange rate to estimate inflation? I don't understand. My little economics would not allow me to think through this.
All right, now I want to find out what are some of the difficulties you face trying to come up with some of your researches, like inflation and even your statistics that you come up with from time to time.
A number of them. What is of major concern to me is meeting up with the contemporary times in terms of what is happening globally, what is happening to individuals' expectations, and so on and so forth. Because as the global economy is changing very quickly, people are adapting to new ways very quickly. We are a bit concerned about going to the outlets to collect prices because now we know that people are doing a lot of online purchases.
Exactly.
So one of the things that we seek to do in the case of inflation is to see whether we can do what is called the web scraping to get prices. We can see whether we can get in touch with the malls to be giving us their prices on a regular basis. So the main concern has to do with how we should catch up with contemporary changes. The challenge is that GSS cannot do it on its own. One of the things that we are excited about is the digitization agenda that the government is aggressively pursuing. If we hold on to it very well, I always say that data will become a byproduct. Because once you digitize your economy, look at what we did during the COVID-19 peak. We relied on call detail records. We got it from our telecommunication group. And all that we did was to advise government on how the lockdown, how persons in Ghana are responding to the lockdown. We didn't have to go out to collect data. In any case, it was dangerous doing that. So we need to tag onto the digitalization agenda, tag onto administrative data, and then we can be producing data on a more regular basis at a relatively lower cost. Indeed, there's a study that has shown that countries that have invested in their data systems, not data collection, their data systems, getting the protection agency to work, getting the data governance institution to work, getting MDAs to be responsive. That is the national statistical system. If you invest every dollar in a data system, you get $32 in return.
That's a lot of money.
This is where we need to get to as a country.
Now, since we've brought up the issue of digitalization, let's not talk about the NI and the National Identification Card and how people are quite concerned about the fact that why have I given my data to NIA and they have my biodata and all that, and I still go to the telcos, still go to the hospital, I still go to the bank, and I start to give them the same information again. Now, what exactly is the problem here? And what's the connection between yourself and the data collected like that of the NIA?
So let me start with the second part of your question. I would put it in the continuous tense. We are building a relationship with NIA, and going forward, we are going to strengthen that relationship, because in a lot of other jurisdictions, they've relied on the national ID to connect all the data sets that one can think about. Indeed, it is imperative to say that there's a conversation ongoing between the National Identification Authority, the Birth and Death Registry, Ghana Police, Ghana Immigration Services. Later, we're going to bring other institutions on board, including the Ghana Education Service and all the other security agencies. That whole conversation is how to make data interoperable and in a secured way. Two things. So do systems in NIA speak to the systems in the other institutions, so that data would seamlessly, in a protected way, run from one MDA to the other. And we've already embarked on a steady visit to Denmark. They are using what they call the CPR, which simply connects data across government ministries. So I don't need to write a letter to an MDA requesting for data. My system here is connected to their system. They anonymize the data. I get the data. I produce the report, and I advise the government. So going forward, that is what it should be. I am not too sure about the storyline on banks collecting data, the same data that they've given to NIA, But again, because I sit on the NIA board, I know that there's ongoing conversation between NIA and the banks. It could be the initial stages where banks would want to tread cautiously, so they are still collecting this data. But I'm pretty optimistic that with time, all this will be centralized, banks can access it, all the other government agencies can access the NIA data for whatever they want to use it for.
Not the conversation doesn't just go with the banks, but the telcos. I mean, they are doing registration where I have to go and give the same data, in as much as they are still taking the data from my national identification card. I'm still giving my bio data and all that. Is that not a conflict?
That's what I'm saying, that if they are doing it, then they are just treading cautiously.
It's not if, it's been done. Which I believe you've gone to register your card and you might have gone through the same system. So it's not a matter of if, it's really happening. What should be done? What should the advice be?
You see, let's try and draw a line between data collection, data validation, and data verification. I personally do not see any challenge if the banks are doing it for purposes of verification.
How about the telcos?
I mean, if they're also doing it for purpose of verification, yes. As I'm saying, it's not data collection, it's data verification. They need to get the systems to sync. And the only way you can get the systems to sync is if you're able to verify the data. Once they verify it, going forward, anytime there's update, they pick it up from the National Identification Authority. All right, and when are you expecting another work like what you just gave us this year on inequality? Is there any other work coming in the pipe? Yes, so we've already put out our release calendar. We'll make a copy available to you. This year we're going all out. We're hoping that we're going to have about 80 publications this year. 80 publications? Yes. So next year, next week or the week after, we're going to come up with our migration report, which is going to tell us what is happening to different regions in terms of how migration has impacted on their regions. We're going to see what is happening to child migration, and then what policymakers should think about. Another publication that we're going to see within the next month is what we call the Trade Vulnerability Report. We are really working towards getting that report out because of what happened in Russia, Ukraine. Every country should assess its vulnerability in terms of where are they exporting to, where are they importing from, what is the level of stability that we have in these countries. I mean, I can give you a heads up that Ghana, our major export country, is India. So if you're thinking about the stability of the country and India is not stable, then you should think about what is going to happen to our foreign exchange earnings if something happens in India. We import mainly from China. If there's instability in China, what is going to happen to our imports that we rely on for our feeding and so on and so forth. So it's one of the reports that is of high priority for us, and we're going to make sure that within the next month we're going to release that. Professor Samuel KOBINA Anim has been my guest today on the show, and he is government statistician. We've been talking about everything statistics, we've been data collection and how best it could be used. I'm grateful. Thank you so much. Thank you. This is Mother Time. I am Bright and Bye.